Chapter 6 is going to go ahead and focus in on analyzing the audience. So before we begin with the material with Chapter 6, let's go ahead and just take a look at our chapter reminders. Please make sure you're taking notes over this chapter, as it will become your study guide for both the test and for the comprehensive final at the end of the semester. Also, please make sure you read Chapter 6. After reading Chapter 6, you should be able to define and apply the key terms, and you also should be able to answer the questions at the end of Chapter 6. So Chapter 6, analyzing the audience.
The loss of these wonderful people should make every one of us strive to be better. To be better in our private lives, to be better friends and neighbors and co-workers and parents. And if, as has been discussed in recent days, their death helps usher in more civility in our public discourse, let us remember it is not because a simple lack of civility caused this tragedy. It did not. But rather because only a more civil and honest public discourse can help us face up to the challenges of our nation in a way that would make them proud.
So as we noticed with this particular video clip, it kind of leads into our first main point of audience-centeredness. When we are thinking about our speech topic, our presentation, our main points, our organizational pattern, we always want to maintain a audience-centeredness. And that is where we put the audience in the foremost in the mind of us as the speaker during the speech presentation and the preparation. So when we're thinking about audience-centeredness, one thing to consider are these series of questions to kind of get you going in the correct direction, both in the preparation and in the presentation. First, to whom am I speaking? What's the knowledge level of your audience? What's the age? What's their experience with your topic? Each of those can make a drastically different presentation. What do I want them to know, believe, or do? So what is my audience outcome? What do I want my audience to take away from my presentation? If it's an informative speech, what information do you want them to gain? If it's a persuasive speech, what type of action do you want them to now start doing? And then if it's a demonstration speech, what sort of process should they be able to replicate on their own? And then what is the most effective way to accomplish what we want our audience to do? And that comes to our organizational pattern and how we present our topic. So one way to make that connection to the audience is through identification, where you can emphasize common values, goals, and experiences. So how can you relate to your audience members, not only in your mind, but through what you say, what you do, and your presentation? One thing we have to be careful of is the idea of egocentrism, where it's the tendency to be concerned with our own values, beliefs, and well-being, and not caring about our audience. So it's really important to make sure that, as they say, check the ego at the door. As a speaker or presenter, you can't come across as above the audience or come across as speaking down to your audience. So some of our audience analysis is going to happen prior to the speech. Others aspects of audience analysis are going to happen during the speech. So some things that we can take a look at prior to our speech, if we know our audience, would be age, gender, religion, sexual orientation, racial, ethnical, cultural backgrounds, and group membership. So obviously, when we look at the age portion of things, if I was going to be talking to a group or an audience about how to do a formatting function in Google Docs. Obviously, with my younger group, my elementary age kids, I'm going to have to first start with, all right, let's get on the Google Doc. Here's how it works. If it's a group of high school students, I could say, open up a blank Google Doc, here we go. And then they'll be all able to do that. Group membership is another example where it can have an impact, both positive or negative, on our speech. So if we're doing a persuasive speech about gun control, and we have two audiences, the first being the NRA, the National Rifle Association, or the second audience being Mothers Against Gun Violence, each one of those two audiences, we have to approach the topic differently. We also have to be careful of stereotyping. And all of you should be familiar with that is of how we oversimplified an image of a group, and it's also done by assuming all members are alike. So a stereotype that a lot of people have is teenagers are bad drivers. So they develop that stereotype because when they look at the data, most teenagers are the ones that are having accidents. Just like with anything new, you're not a pro or professional the first time you do it. So we have to be careful of stereotyping. So when we look at the situation for which we're going to speak in, this is another aspect of that audience analysis that we can do ahead of time. We could take a look at the size of the people we're speaking to. There's a big difference in presentations when you're talking to 3 people versus 300. What's the physical setting? Are we going to be in a roundtable discussion? Am I going to be at a lectern? Am I going to be in a classroom? What does that all look like? What's the disposition towards the topic? So our audience, what is their viewpoint on the topic? Is this something that they signed up for, or is this something that the boss is making them do? What's the disposition towards the speaker? And then towards the occasion. So through audience analysis, one thing that we have to make sure that we're always doing is taking a look at the audience interest. How are they going to engage with our presentation? So it starts with being creative and being prepared.
Suppose a total stranger was responsible for making life or death decisions about your life. You'd want to have a say in who that person was, wouldn't you? Well, total strangers do make decisions that affect you every single day. Those total strangers are called members of Congress, senators, and president. And you can help choose all these people by doing one simple thing: voting on Election Day.
So as a speaker, one thing that we always have to be cognizant of is our attitude. If we go in with a poor or negative attitude, that's the reputation that our topic and presentation is going to be received on. But our attitude is just simply the frame of mind in favor of or opposed to the person, policy, belief, institution, etc. So we also have to remember that our audience membership is going to have all kinds of different attitudes. Some are going to be there willingly, some are going to be forced there. It all just kind of depends and everything in between. So we have to make sure that we put our best foot and effort forward. So another aspect we have to be careful of is how we adapt to our audiences. Sometimes the unexpected happens and we just have to prepare and respond accordingly.
Those of you who oppose a sales tax for items purchased on the internet believe that we are taxed enough already. No one likes to pay taxes, but an internet sales tax is one way for our state to conquer its budget deficit. As more and more people do their shopping online, the state will continue to lose more and more revenue. According to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Wisconsin currently loses more than $150 million a year because of unpaid sales tax from online purchases. That's $150 million a year that could be used to put people to work, to fund social services, to pay for roads, and to improve the quality of education right here at our university.
So when it comes to getting the information about our audience, sometimes we have a lot of data or information or a snapshot before we begin our presentation. So all of you know who's in your class, who's in the audience, who you're going to be speaking in front of. Sometimes we don't necessarily have a good grasp or understanding of our audience, so we have to use mechanisms, tools, and practices to quickly gain an understanding without losing control of our presentation. So this is where we have the opportunity as a speaker to use questions. So we're going to take a look at these 3 different question types. First, we're going to take a look at the fixed alternative, then the scale, and the open-ended. So as we go through these lists, the level of control from the speaker to the audience is going to get less and less. So our most controlled option is going to be our fixed alternative. Our fixed alternative is where we provide the question and then the answers for the audience to respond. So we know exactly how they're going to respond. So in this example, do you know what the insanity plea is in the U.S. legal system? If I was speaking in front of a large group and I had technology available, I could do a quick poll, or I can do a simple raise of hands. So I would go through and ask, do you know what the insanity plea in the U.S. legal system is? If yes, raise your hand. A portion raises their hand. No, a portion raises their hand. And not sure, a portion raises their hand. From that straw poll, pretty quick, I can get a determination of whether or not my audience has a good understanding. This allows us as a speaker to adapt to our audience. If most all of our audience understood what the insanity plea was, there wouldn't be a reason for us to explain it. But on the same token, if nobody in the audience knew what it was, it would be important and foundational to our presentation to explain that particular topic. Getting a little more open, and we get into the scale. So once again, with this particular question, how often do you believe the U.S. insanity plea is used in the U.S. court cases? Very seldom through very often. So what I can have people do in my audience is hold up fingers, 1 finger being very seldom and 5 fingers being very often, and then they can pick and choose the fingers they want to use to demonstrate where they are on that scale. We can also do this through technology. This is a little bit more open than our first fixed alternative, as we don't necessarily know where our audience is going to fall. The most open way and the most dangerous way when it comes to audience control and losing control of our presentation is an open-ended question. Unfortunately, with open-ended questions, we can only hypothesize what the potential questions or answers might be, so it's wide open. So for this particular instance, we have, what is your opinion about the insanity plea in the U.S. court cases? We could have 2 very vocal people in our audience and say that my son was killed by this person who used the insanity plea and got away with murder. And then we can have another person in our audience on the far extreme saying nobody should ever be able to be convicted on the insanity plea. Another opportunity is for us to complete questionnaires prior to our speech presentation, collect the data, and then kind of use that as a spring point or a starting point. This can be done when people sign up for the presentation. This could be done as people are entering the room, whatever that happens to be. But this allows us to get data from our audience and then use it as a reference.
I know from my class survey that all but 2 of you oppose a state sales tax for online purchases. You cite 2 main reasons for your opposition. First, you believe we're taxed enough already. And second, you think it would be too difficult to implement. During my speech today, I will address both objections in an effort to convince you that an internet sales tax is needed now more than ever.
As we've been mentioning throughout this whole entire chapter, it's important that we adapt to our audience. And there's 2 ways we do that, as I mentioned before. The first is adapting before the presentation. So we assess how our audience will respond. And then we make the adjustments to the speech to make it more clear and convincing. So knowing something about our audience allows us to have a better starting point and make adjustments. This is about the easiest way to prepare for a speech, and the harder way, adapting to the audience, occurs during the presentation. So adapting during the presentation or speech to adjust to unexpected circumstances, and we always have to be watching for feedback. Some great examples would be if I had some jokes or stories in my presentation that were supposed to get a lot of laughs from the audience, and the first joke that I gave just did not work, I might consider not using the remainder of my jokes so that I don't further alienate the audience. Watching for feedback, this can simply come from watching how the audience is responding. If you're talking way too fast and moving through the material way too fast and the audience doesn't have a way to slow the presentation, they become lost and confused, and then at that point you've lost them. So it's really important to kind of pace yourself and monitor and observe and watch for that feedback from your audience. If they're agreeing with you and they're processing what you're saying as you're going along at a good pace, you're good to go. But if you're going way too fast and they look confused and they're having side conversations, it would be a good indicator to kind of slow down. And there's nothing wrong with asking during your presentation, are we going too fast? Do we need to speed up? And your audience will always be receptive to those kind of questions. So audience analysis, chapter 6, analyzing the audience. Just a couple quick reminders here before we go. Please make sure that you've taken notes over this presentation, as this will become your study guide for both the test and for the final. Ensure that you've read chapter 6 from the textbook, and after reading chapter 6 of the textbook, you should be able to define and apply the key terms. Upon reading and completing the chapter, you should also be able to answer the questions at the end.